And here we are having our final interview at Apologiaforum with Professor Alister McGrath. So, Professor, you gave your final talk on the topic of narrative apologetics and how it appeals to our feelings and imagination. Could you explain what does a narrative apologetics mean and why is it so important?
Well, a narrative approach to apologetics emphasizes the importance of telling stories. Not stories we've invented, but very often stories of our own journey to faith or something like that. And in many ways, the appeal of narrative apologetics is quite subjective. People find argumentative apologetics quite abstract, quite distant. Whereas when someone tells the story about how they come to faith, that's interesting. It engages them. And as you'll probably know, there's a lot of psychological evidence that human beings respond very well to narratives. And in the New Testament, there are so many narratives. Paul's account of his own conversion, the parables very often take the forms of narratives. Think of the parable of the prodigal son. So in many ways, it's helpful to ask, how can we use these narratives in doing apologetics? Not displacing arguments, but supplementing them. And very often, when someone tells the story of their own conversion, they may make reference to arguments that helped bring them to faith. But the really important thing is, here is the story of how I responded to God and the difference it made to me. It's not just saying Christianity is true, it's saying Christianity is real. It has the capacity to change my life. And that's a very important point that narrative apologetics makes very well.
And I can imagine that played a huge role in the spreading of the faith in the first centuries of Christianity. And besides, Jesus told a lot of stories, didn't he?
Well, he did, and I think that authorizes us to do the same thing. And so we might retell the parables and make some very good points. We might tell the story of our own conversions, or we might use some other biblical stories, like, for example, the story of the Exodus from Egypt, which is a very good way of talking about how God changes situations. So I think narrative apologetics is very helpful, and it works especially well in preaching, I think, because people really find themselves connecting with the stories and thinking them through.
And building on that, also in your talks you mentioned that C.S. Lewis also viewed stories as very important in reaching the people with his message. So how does he achieve this in his bestsellers The Narnia and the novel That Hideous Strength?
Well, Lewis is a master of the art of narrative apologetics. And what Lewis does in the Chronicles of Narnia is to retell the Christian story. He relocates it in this realm of Narnia, but all the great themes of creation and redemption and Christian discipleship and the Christian hope are all there, but they're expressed through telling stories and exploring how these themes affect individual people's lives. So in many ways, looking at the children in the Narnia narratives, we see how they become involved in this greater story of Narnia, and as they do that, they discover meaning and purpose and significance. So we have this very important point that each of us has our own individual story, but when we connect up with the greater story of Narnia, or of course God, then that means we suddenly discover meaning, significance, and we live our lives with a new energy and commitment. So Lewis is helping us to understand how meaning is all about connecting up with something that's bigger than us, and a narrative is a very good way of expressing that. And in The Hideous Strength, of course, what Lewis is doing is critiquing what I would call scientific overreach. In other words, where science begins to explore areas where it really shouldn't be at all. And Lewis is able to tell a story which helps us to appreciate how important this is. And it's far better than just an argument that science can go wrong. Lewis shows us how science can go wrong by telling a story in which this is the central theme. So it's a very rich and very powerful theme.
Wow, those are very important points there, and I must say, when I listened to your talk, it really stuck with me how you explained that the children in Narnia, like, they gained value and meaning to their lives by becoming part of the correct story about the realm of Narnia. So how would you outline from a Christian perspective the equivalent grand story in our world in which one could step in and become part of?
Well, the Christian grand story is that of we are part of the created order. We are loved by a God who has redeemed us and has called us, and will one day call us home to be with him. But in the meantime, there are things that we need to be doing to make this world a better place. And so if we take Lewis's approach, what he is saying is we step into this story of God creating and engaging the world, and we say, that's what I could be doing. That's how I fit into the story. I have certain gifts or talents that I could use to advance the story. And by doing that, I'm both doing something that is good, I'm doing something for God, and also I'm fulfilling myself. So at 3 different levels, doing something for God, doing something that is good, and doing something that brings me meaning and value, they're all there. And the story holds them all together.
I get excited about this already, and we can see how that this works. This works on me right now. This works on people due to psychological reasons. However, on a critical note, as the utility of narrative apologetics seems to actually hinge on there being a psychological and cultural need for story-driven treatment of life's big questions. Now, one could also note that the infatuation with stories and like connecting the dots individually type of thinking that is so prevalent today is itself problematic, as it might relativize the conveyed message and downplay the importance of articulable facts and along with trivializing dogmatic and scientific and philosophical discourse. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that's a fair point to make, that there is a risk that we, in effect, come to rely too much on something that is very much a product of our situation here and now. And I recognize that, but I must make the counterpoint, which is that this works very, very effectively. For reasons we don't entirely understood, it's as if human beings love stories and want to work out how they fit into a story. And therefore, it seems entirely reasonable to say this is a God-given way of gaining access to people's hearts and minds. And the points you make are good. Narrative apologetics will never displace systematic theology or anything like that, but it gives us a way of engaging people, a way of connecting with people, which works very, very well, and therefore it's something that apologetics, I think, needs to make use of.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And so if by watching this video now, someone actually now has become interested to engage in this form of apologetics in order to like plant the good seeds, so to say, in people's minds, what kinds of stories might one tell?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Let me suggest 2 different kinds of stories. One is to take one of the New Testament parables, for example, the parable of the prodigal son, and say, look, I'm going to tell this story, and I want you, the person I'm talking to realize that actually you are that son. You are someone who's gone your own way and has realized that life had not the fulfillment you had hoped it would be, and are wondering if there's a way back to find God, reconnect with God, and thus find joy and peace. And you can retell that story and help them see how they fit into that story, how they're part of it, and where it would take them in the future. But a second story you can tell is your own story, your own journey of faith, whether it's discovering God or growing deeper to God, and in effect say, look, this is my story. It's all about how God became real and significant to me, and it could be your story as well. And it really helps people who are listening to these stories, because they realize there's not simply somebody giving an argument, it's somebody saying, my life has been changed. Yours could be changed as well. It's all about the reality of faith, not simply the truth of faith. And I think for many reasons, that's a very powerful approach. And also, it means that your own story can be apologetically helpful.
That's wonderful. I actually have a saying in my own life that if God can change me, God can change anyone. Just came to mind from that. So We have now established that telling appropriate stories could be transformative in bringing people in connection with our origins and purpose in God. My final question would be this. Since faith is given only by God, how do you view the role of the human person and by extension the entire role of apologetics in this act of God?
Well, apologetics does not create faith. God is the one who creates faith. God is the one who converts. What apologetics does is remove barriers, because very often people put barriers in God's way. I can't see this clearly. I don't understand this. And very often the task of the apologist is to clear away the obstacles, to allow God to, in effect, step into that person's life, to allow that person to open their lives to God. So think of apologetics as clearing the ground for an encounter with God, getting rid of some of the barriers. Perhaps telling your own story will help you them understand how you came to faith. But the point then is when they say, actually, I want to know more about this, then maybe that's the point at which God steps in and takes over.
That's wonderful. And I also remember that in your talk, I think you had this parable of opening a window. That was so good. So just can you tell it?
Yes, let me invite you to imagine you're in a dark room and there's a wooden shutter on the wall. And you open the wooden shutter and light flows into the room. The room is brilliantly lit. You didn't cause that light. You simply removed a barrier so the light could come in. Apologetics is like opening that shutter, helping the light to come in. You can help remove obstacles to faith by telling your own story, by using people like C.S. Lewis. But the key point is you're doing something that's preparing the way for God to finish the job by coming into their lives and transforming them.
Professor McGrath, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.